Back in the year 2000, I was living in Los Angeles, California, and I guess you could say I was an up-and-coming musician trying to work my way up the ladder of the music industry. And as usual, when you're a young and up-and-coming musician, you usually don't have that much money, and I was definitely one of those types of musicians. I had nothing. But I did have a pair of rollerblades, and I used to rollerblade all over town, and I would come across these really interesting, cool bookstores, often secondhand bookstores, and I came across a book by a pretty crazy out there author called Robert Anton Wilson, and the book was called Cosmic Trigger. Now, in this book, there was a Zen koan that went like this. First there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. And I remember at the time reading it and not really understanding it. And that, koans usually have that kind of effect on you. They're confusing at first. But they're like these seeds that work in your brain, and they somehow, over time, transform your way of thinking. I guess that's a good way of describing them. And over time, I realized that this Zen koan kind of represented my life. What it came to mean to me was, first there is a mountain is when you're a child, you're sort of connected to your higher self, or whatever you want to call it, this sort of intuitive part of yourself that you don't really question things, you just kind of live and you express yourself as you are. And then as time progresses and you grow up and you get older, you lose that connection, or at least I did. When I was in my 20s, actually just after I left Los Angeles again, I lost that connection somehow. Music became more about making money. It was a job, and that initial spark that got me into music kind of got lost. So, like I said, first there is a mountain meant you were connected to that higher part of yourself. Then there is no mountain. That was kind of like my 20s and 30s. I lost that connection to my higher self, and music became work, and it was all about the hustle and trying to make a living and try to get ahead in the music industry. It became very serious, and certain things happened in my life a few years ago that kind of made me have to rethink everything again. And ever since then, I feel like slowly but surely I'm starting to reconnect to that higher self, that higher part of myself that I was connected to when I was a child and a teenager, when I was doing music, where I could just flow with the music that wanted to come out. So I'm in the process of the third part of that koan, where it says, then there is. And by that I mean I'm starting to find that connection again. I haven't really completely got there yet. That's why I'm really, really excited to be doing this podcast, because I feel like part of it is documenting that process of me connecting to that place again where music can just freely flow through me again. I'm Eshan Kadaru, aka Push for Life, and welcome to the second episode of Music, Sounds and Silence. In this episode, I'm just going to give you some context as to where I've come from and how I've gotten to where I am right now, which is in your ears, talking about music, sounds and silence. I have to say I feel extremely privileged to have been born when I was born. I was born in 1975, which means my earliest memories of popular music are around about 1982. I was living in Northern Ireland at the time in a small town called Armagh. Shout out to Armagh. And all of my family would religiously watch a TV show called Top of the Pops, which is this legendary music show that featured the top charts of the time and also would show emerging artists. Now, around 1982, some of the popular music at the time was The Human League, Soft Cell, Culture Club, and they were all utilizing these sounds that were very new, and they were all sort of synthesizer based, and that really became the sort of 80s sound that we all think of now. But that's not the only reason I feel privileged to have been born at this time to experience this music. It's also because in 1982, the first real home computer was released, which was the Commodore 64. And the Commodore 64 had an SID sound chip on it, and it could be used to make 3 channels of synthesis music. And so that meant, you could play these, very, very basic games at the time, which were amazing, but they all had these synthesizer tracks on them, which made a deep, deep impression on people of my generation, because we would all play these games, and it was just this whole new world of computer technology that we could use in our homes. Now, in 1983 was the birth of MIDI. So that's another piece of technology that came around just when I was very, very young, and would go on to become a huge part of home computer studios. When I was 10 years old, the general climate in Northern Ireland was pretty violent, to be honest. There was the British Army who was there, and there was the IRA, there was bombings and people being shot a lot of times, and my mother decided to up and go to Germany. So we moved to Germany in 1985 to this tiny village in the middle of nowhere, and I couldn't even speak the language. So it did take me quite a while to learn the language. It took me about 1.5 years to be sufficient enough to the point where my mother asked me if I wanted to learn an instrument again. I had played piano in Ireland, but I obviously had to stop when we moved to Germany because I couldn't speak the language. At that point in time, I was just this enormous fan of Bruce Lee, the martial artist, and there was a movie that I would obsess over called Enter the Dragon. And towards the end of the movie, he would pick up these 2 pretty big sticks, and he just defended himself against this huge group of crazy people, and he would just beat them up with these sticks. So when my mother asked me if I wanted to learn an instrument, I actually really truly believed if I learned to play the drums, I would be able to do what Bruce Lee did in Enter the Dragon. So that was my main motivation of learning the drums. But I have to admit, I just had a profound interest in rhythm at the time. So at age 12, I decided to learn the drums, and I immediately fell in love with it. I had this great teacher who was a jazz drummer, and he just instilled this enormous passion within me to actually become a musician. I'd wanted to become a classical pianist while still living in Ireland. I was this huge fan of Chopin and Beethoven and that kind of thing. But when I met this drum teacher, he just made me so fascinated for everything that you could do with rhythm. So from that point onwards, when I was 12, all I was doing was just studying rhythm. When I listened to music, all I was listening to was the drums. Drums became my life. In early 1992, after playing drums for about 5 years, I had my first real brush with computer technology that you could actually make your own music on. The second really cool computer that was released, a home computer, was called an Atari. And in 1989, Steinberg released a program called Cubase, which, still exists to this day. But back then in 92, on this Atari, this program seemed like it was magic. Like, up until that point, as a musician, you were either a pianist, or you were the drummer, or you could play the trumpet, but you were really just focused on your own instrument. But now with this computer technology, all of a sudden you could program in via MIDI a piano track, and then you could write the drum track, and stuff that seems just completely normal now. Back then, this was just completely revolutionizing in my brain. I couldn't actually fathom that I could just compose all of these different things and then the computer would play them. And now, unfortunately, my friend only had this piece of technology for about a week, but it did sort of open my eyes to what was possible. But I have to admit, at that time, no one knew that computer technology had this sort of exponential curve and that things were just going to get crazier and crazier. at the time, this just seemed like I said, it was just like magic. Shortly after this, I moved to London in England. And it was a big move for me because I was going over there single-mindedly to become a successful session drummer. That was like my big dream, was to go on the road, to play with different bands, to see the world and play on stages in front of thousands and thousands of people. And I was very, very lucky at the time because I moved there mid-1993, and within about a month or so, I fell in with a band called Incognito, and specifically the sort of mastermind behind Incognito, the producer, called John Paul Bluey Monick. Now, Bluey is just this amazing person, this extremely giving, sort of like fatherly figure these days, of literally thousands of musicians. Like, I know well over 1,000 musicians have played with Incognito, and if you come from London and you're, I don't know, over the age of 30, you've most likely come in contact with someone who's played in this band at some point in their life. It's just like a legendary jazz funk band in England. Now, I was studying at a place called Drum Tech at the time, just, you know, doing like a drum course. And when I would come home, oftentimes on my way back, I would pass Bluey's studio in London, and I would just ring the doorbell. He would let me in. I would walk in the back, sit down, and literally just watch him produce for hours. I wouldn't say anything. I would just sit there and soak it all up. So that was one of my first real experiences of being able to watch a great producer just working, composing, working with other musicians, you know, getting a mix right. And I got to see legendary people like, you know, George Benson was in there once, and Bluey was producing one of his tracks. So he wasn't just working on Incognito, he always had other artists in there. And I got to just hang out there. And even at one point, I had my drum kit set up in one of the studios in the studio complex, and I would be able to practice there. So Bluey was just like a mentor to me. And over the next years, whilst I lived in London, this was literally what I would do all the time. I would just go and hang out and watch him produce. But like I said, at that time, I was single-mindedly focused on drumming. All I cared about was becoming the best drummer that I could be. But my next brush with music technology was just around the corner. In 1997, I was working with a band called Acacia, and the keyboardist was a now famous producer called Guy Zigsworth. Guy had this piece of computer technology at the time called a Yamaha QY70. Now, the QY70 was, you know, smaller than a DVD box. It was a little heavier, obviously, but it was like this all-in-one MIDI computer production unit. And I think it had like 16 tracks of MIDI within it. It had a really tiny keyboard on it, and you could make complete, entire music productions on it. And to make a long story short, whilst I was in that band, I ended up buying a QY70 because you could just take it around with you. You could put batteries in it, and you could stick your headphones in it, and wherever you were, you could compose and produce music. And you know, to think about, in that short period of time, you know, just a few years earlier, I'd been playing with the Atari with Cubase on it, and now I had this sort of handheld portable music production hardware that I was carrying around with me, just making tracks on. Already you can see music technology was just moving fast and just becoming faster all the time. So shortly after getting this piece of equipment, I ended up going on the road with this 80s band called Bow Wow Wow. And it's a funny story, actually, because like I said, in the early 80s, 1982, I was just discovering music, and one of my favorite bands was a band called Adam and the Ants. And whilst I was performing with Acacia, the band that Guy Zigsworth had, the bass player of Bow Wow Wow saw me, and he came up to me after a show, and he said, you know, listen, I really enjoyed, you know, your playing and whatever. and I'm in a band called Bow Wow Wow. And, we're about to go on tour in the States. And, would you like to possibly play drums on this reunion tour? Because the original drummer at the time was playing, with, I think, Fatboy Slim at the time. And I'd never heard of the band, but I had been a huge Red Hot Chili Peppers fan. And I remembered hearing, Bow Wow Wow, that sounds familiar. And there was a track on the Red Hot Chili Peppers album Blood Sugar Sex Magic where Anthony Kiedis, the singer, would sing. And I said to the bass player, is that you? And he was like, yeah. And it turned out that Bow Wow Wow was actually the band of Adam and the Ants, who was one of my first favorite bands back in the 80s. So it was weird. It kind of came full circle. I was playing at least with this band that had been part of one of my earliest inspirations of music. So it was an amazing experience for me. And I ended up going on the road with them, touring all over the States the tour was 3 months, and it was in 1997 into 1998. But I ended up taking this QY70, this little music production hardware piece of equipment, on the road with me, and I just studied this thing inside and out. I knew every single detail of this piece of equipment, and I have to say, that probably gave me the basis of what it is I do now, like with the Ableton PUSH and all of the music software I do. That came from just studying this one piece of equipment. Like, I can't stress enough to you how important it is to really understand one thing deeply. I think, these days it's very easy to fall into the trap of just always continuously upgrading your studio with new software and new hardware and just superficially learning how to use a piece of equipment. But I have to tell you, studying this QY70 is really what gave me the most insight into how everything works that I use these days. So that's just a little tip on the side. Now, like I said, when I was initially asked to play with Bow Wow Wow, I'd never really heard of them at all, only in the Red Hot Chili Peppers song. But once we went to the States to do this 3-month tour, I realized that in America they had this enormous cult-like following, and all of the bands that I was into at that time, like the Red Hot Chili Peppers or No Doubt, the Deftones, they all ended up coming to our shows and hanging out with us. And it was really bizarre, because one of my first shows with Bow Wow Wow in Los Angeles at this small nightclub called the Viper Room, all of a sudden I was standing next to Anthony Kiedis, the singer of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, who was telling me that Bow Wow Wow was one of the inspirations for the Red Hot Chili Peppers to even form, and that Flea was this enormous fan of the bass player of Bow Wow Wow. So it was a really amazing experience. So I got to meet all of these really amazing people from the music industry. And after the tour was over, I got back. I toured with another UK sort of jazz hip-hop band called Urban Species. And then I got a call from Interscope Records, who I'd met through Acacia and again with Bow Wow Wow. And they told me that Nine Inch Nails were looking for a drummer. And this was around the time just before the album The Fragile came out, which was in 1999. And I ended up flying over to New Orleans and hanging out at Nothing Studios, which was Trent Reznor's studio, and auditioning with the band, which was absolutely mind-blowing. I got to play, I think, like 9 songs with the band on the initial day of the first audition. That evening, the band called me up and asked me if I wanted to go to the movies with them, and the movie happened to be The Matrix. And then the following day they called me back to the studio and basically asked me if they were to use me, if I was available to come over and immediately start touring with them. And this was all just mind-blowing, and to be able to hang out with Nine Inch Nails and play their music with them was literally a dream come true. It was one of the best musical experiences I've ever had the privilege of having. so far at least. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, it was between me and another drummer, and the other drummer got it for whatever reason. But I was just grateful that I even had the opportunity of hanging out with Nine Inch Nails and playing their music with them. So that was amazing. But that was another brush with technology for me that was just a whole nother level. Like, you know, I had this QY70 that I was playing with, and all of a sudden now I was in New Orleans and I was playing drums with Nine Inch Nails in this audition, and we were playing all of these backing tracks with all of these amazing synth sounds, and obviously Nine Inch Nails was just super next level when it came to music technology. Needless to say, when I got the call that I didn't get the Nine Inch Nails gig, I was just devastated, because at that point in time, I also was coming to the end of the tour with Urban Species, who I'd been on the road with for, I think, about a year and a half all over Europe. That tour came to an end. I was declined to play with Nine Inch Nails, and I didn't have any gigs whatsoever. And I ended up having to, you know, work at like a Starbucks type coffee shop, just making coffee. And it was just a bizarre experience, because I'd been on the road for literally quite a few years, and, you know, this semi-successful session musician, and all of a sudden I experienced my first real downer. Like, it was like, oh, okay, I was going up and up and up, and now I'm going down and down and down. So that was something I would come to see over the long history of my music career, that things never kind of just linearly go up. They go in cycles, up, down, up. So it's kind of like the idea of 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Which is just something to keep in mind if you're starting out in music. You know, things might sort of take off and you're like, oh my God, this is it. This is my big break. But things usually go down again before they go up again. Anyway, like I said, I was working at this coffee store in London, and I was kind of depressed, because I felt like, oh my God, what's happened to my music career? But I still continuously was working on my music. And Guy Zigsworth booked me for a one-off show with this experimental artist called John Hassel, who did this weird sort of trumpet music. He had played with Brian Eno, and I believe he played with Peter Gabriel on, I think it's called The Passion or The Passion of Christ soundtrack. And he was just this really crazy out there trumpet player, but it was brilliant. And Guy had bought another really great piece of music equipment by Roland called an SP808, which was like this digital 4-track that had a hard disk. Actually, it didn't have a hard disk in it. It had a zip drive in it. That's what it was called. And it could hold 100 megabytes of sounds on it, which seems ridiculous now, but at the time was amazing. And like I said, it had 4 tracks on it. It had a built-in effect system, and it could do audio, which was also just this entirely new thing in terms of music technology, because up until that point in time, all I had at my disposal, at least, was MIDI. And now, you know, I had a microphone, I had a guitar, I could plug it into this SP808, and I could actually work with real instruments and vocals. And that, again, just opened up this entire new world. And Guy, at the time, was kind enough to lend me this piece of equipment indefinitely, which ended up being, like, I think at least 6 months, if not more. And I worked with this really great artist at the time called Adama, and we worked on a whole bunch of demos. I really started getting into composition and music technology at the time. So like I said, this was around 1999, and again, another mind-blowing experience with this amazing piece of music technology. But like I said, you know, this was just a one-off show, and Guy ended up, you know, asking for that piece of technology back. I was left with my QY70, which was great, but I was working at a coffee shop. I realized, you know, things aren't going that well for me here in London. And, you know, I'd met all of these great people in Los Angeles, you know, especially at Interscope, the record company, and they were telling me, you know, you should come out to Los Angeles, you know, you get so much work over here as a drummer. And, you know, various things were going on in my life at that time, And I decided, you know what? I'm young, I'm single, I'm just going to go for it. So I decided this is it. I'm going to move to Los Angeles, which was no easy feat because you can't just, as a British citizen, just decide to move to America and, you know, start off as a musician. I had to get a music lawyer who had to basically prove that I could do something that another American couldn't. Another American musician, that is, couldn't. And so I had to get all of these references from all of the people I'd worked with. And he was a great music lawyer, and he helped me get this very special visa that meant that I could go and work as a musician in the States. And as luck would have it, just as I decided to go to the States to pursue my dreams over there, Guy Zigsworth's assistant had just quit, and he asked me if I would like to be his assistant. And I had to decide at that moment, you know, do I follow my dreams as a session drummer, or do I become the assistant to one of the best producers that I'd ever known? And it was a tough decision, but I decided, you know what, I've decided to go to the States to go and work as a session drummer, and that's what I'm going to do. And that's basically what I did. So in early 2000, I packed my bags and I flew over to Los Angeles to start over. Now, I was very lucky to have made all of the connections I had whilst I was in the States a few years previous with Acacia and with Bow Wow Wow. So when I got there, I actually ended up having a gig waiting for me with this industrial metal electronic band called Kidney Thieves. So it was great because I didn't have any income whatsoever, but the singer said, you know, I have a spare room, you can sleep here for free, you know, you're playing in my band, that's how I'm going to pay you, basically. So I had a place to stay whilst I was playing with that band. And you know, to cut a long story short, my time in LA was just this crazy rock and roll period of my life. I was there for about a year and a half in total. I was auditioning all the time. There was this one guy called Barry Squire who worked at, I believe, Columbia Records at the time, and he was like the go-to person for all types of bands in Los Angeles who needed musicians. They all seemed to go to him, and he would arrange these enormous, almost like casting cattle calls, where you would just get a call the day before and he would say, you know, here's come and pick this CD up, you know, I don't know, in like Santa Monica, and a day or two later you would have an audition with the band at like SIR Studios, which was like this you know, professional rehearsal space. And at the time I didn't even have a car, so I had rollerblades. That was my only way of getting around Los Angeles, and Los Angeles is big. So I would like have to skate for like 45 minutes to go and pick up a CD, get back, and then I would just listen to the tracks. You know, there might be 3 to 5 tracks on there that you had to learn off by heart to the best of your abilities. And then you would go to this casting cattle call, and it was almost like a casting for a movie or something, because you would go in there and you'd be in this room full of other drummers or other musicians, and then when it was your turn you would get called up. They would say stand up against this wall, and they would take a Polaroid of your face so they could see you, and you'd have to fill in this form where you would speak about what it is you do, blah blah blah. And one of the things I realized whilst I was there doing all of these casting calls was that all of the musicians who would go to these calls were amazing musicians. That was just sort of like the baseline was just everyone was great. So at the end of the day, it was all more about, it was about looks a lot of the times. A lot of these bands were commercial bands. They wanted to make it big. And it was more about how you fit into the overall scheme of how the band looked and how they wanted to present themselves. Back then, there was a certain look, and I really didn't fit into that look. I was just, you know, I had my own thing going on. And, you know, a lot of times I would be complimented on my playing, but I really didn't get a lot of gigs. But I did end up auditioning for a lot of cool bands, so the experience itself was very, very cool. But as with everything in life, all good things must come to an end. And like I said, I moved to Los Angeles in early 2000, and I was in Los Angeles in September of 2001, the 11th of September specifically 2001, when the planes flew into the World Trade Center. And I have to say that kind of freaked me out so much. Like anyone who remembers that time in our history will remember that was a crazy time. And then George Bush came into power, and I was like, you know what? I don't really feel comfortable here anymore in the States. I don't want to live in this environment. And I decided, you know what? I'm leaving. And I think it was November of 2001, I left Los Angeles and I ended up moving to Germany, which is where I live now. Just like I said before, remember when I was talking about when I was sort of coming up in London, everything was going up and up and up. And just after the Nine Inch Nails audition, everything kind of went down and crashed, so to speak. And I decided to lift off again, and I moved to Los Angeles and had this amazing, crazy rock and roll time over there. And it was just brilliant, amazing, and great. Well, when I decided to move to Germany, I moved very close to where I grew up, which is a tiny village in the middle of nowhere. And as you can imagine, as a musician, there was no work for me whatsoever. So again, I found myself in a position where I had nothing. I literally had nothing. I had no income. I had no gigs. I was in a completely different country to where I had, networked for over 7 years, which was in London. But somehow, the internet was just sort of up and coming at that time. And I ended up sort of via email connecting with people in London again. And fortunately, people enjoyed my drumming so much that they ended up deciding to fly me out to London. And I ended up still touring from my base in Germany. I would fly over to England and then start my tours from there with whatever band I was playing with. The first band that I participated in, again, after I moved away from Los Angeles, was this band called Dog, which was a sort of almost like Prodigy type band. Unfortunately, that never went anywhere, but we did tour all over England at the time. And then after that, I toured with Irish singer-songwriter called Gemma Hayes. I did another US tour, which was really amazing in 2003. So again, things were going up and up and up. And again, I think just after my tour with Gemma Hayes, things went down again. And I found myself without any gigs. And actually, that was a period of 2 years. I didn't have any gigs. And another thing that I didn't have was a drum kit, which is a story for another time. But around that time, I had no equipment at all, and I was stuck in Germany. But one thing that I ended up discovering via a good friend of mine called Mike DiMattia, who was BT's assistant. BT's this sort of electronica dance trance artist. Mike DiMattia told me there was this new software called Ableton Live. So this was back in, I think around 2002 actually, when he started telling me about it. And around 2003, once my sort of session drumming thing kind of stopped again for a while and I didn't have a drum kit, I bought my first laptop and I ended up putting Ableton Live on it. And again, just to sort of continue with the music technology thing, I went from my QY70, which was all MIDI based, and that was the only piece of music equipment that I had, to this laptop based software system that again just completely blew my head off and opened up all of these new possibilities. And I mean, this probably was Ableton 2 or 3, version 2 or 3 that is, at the time. So it was still very early days, but the Ableton concept of how it's done with the session view and the arrangement view, that was all already there back then. Even though I didn't have a drum kit and I didn't have any gigs or anything, I was able to take the time to study this software. So I really got into Ableton, and shortly thereafter, another piece of music software that everyone probably knows now was just released, and it was called Propellerhead's Reason. I was using Ableton and Reason at the time, and just dove into both of those software systems and just learned them inside out. I almost became like a specialist in both of them because I didn't have anything else to do. I had no gigs, I had no money. All I had was a laptop with these two pieces of software on them. And again, I have to stress that, that was a blessing in disguise, because I didn't have any time. I did have time. That was all I had. But I didn't have any gigs. I didn't have any money. And all I had was time. And all I did was just study these just 2 pieces of software. And I just went deep into the inner workings of them and basically started composing and producing music. Now, that's all well and good. But this went on for a few years. And at a certain point, I was like, oh my God, I don't have any income. I was a waiter at a pizza restaurant, like a stone's throw away from where I live, which is not something that I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I can't just live off of, thin air and programming music into my computer. I have to start making a living again. And if I was at a point where I was like, I think I'm going to have to just do this music career and that's it. It was great while it lasted, but I'm going to just have to go stacking shelves in a convenience store or something, because all I've ever done is music. I don't have any kind of grades that I can say, okay, I'm going to go and relearn something else and go down a different career path. I was like, this is it. I have to go stack shelves or something. But again, as luck would have it, almost at my lowest point, I ended up getting a call again from London, and there was this band at the time who were interested in using me as their drummer, and the band was called SAP. And at that point in time, which was 2006, they had a hit because they made the theme music, which ended up being used on Grey's Anatomy, which is a huge soap opera style hospital series that probably most of you have heard of, at least. But anyway, their music ended up being used as the title track for that. And anyway, they made this music which ended up being labeled Toytronica. And it was right up my street. It was very experimental, great songs. And I ended up flying over there to audition, and they pretty much immediately said, yeah, let's do this. And I ended up touring with them for the better part of a year all over Europe. It was a really, really great experience. Again, it was just completely wild rock and roll craziness. So I was going back and forth from Germany to London again, and from there all over Europe. But one thing led to another again, and we parted ways just about a year later in 2007. And as luck would have it, Blue Man Group were opening a new show in Germany, and through various connections that I had, they ended up calling me and asking me if I would like to audition as a drummer. So I flew up to Berlin. They had this huge casting call, and I made my way through this casting call, and they basically said, we're very interested in using you, but there's a second casting call which was going to be in Amsterdam at the time. So they said, we'll call you again and have you come out to Amsterdam. Cut a long story short, basically flew out to Amsterdam, and then they offered me the gig, which again, this was like another amazing experience that I was very privileged to have, because I had actually been a big fan of Blue Man Group. I'd never seen the show up until then, but they had this advert for Intel that I remember seeing, and I had heard their music, and I'd seen their DVD of a tour that they had previously done, and I was just always mind blown by Blue Man Group. So to be offered to play with them in a new production here in Germany was another dream come true. It was like, wow, So from there, I ended up moving to Berlin to study with the drummers there. An amazing drummer called Dave Anania, who absolutely mind-blowing drummer who'd been a long-time drummer with Blue Man Group, but he was the Blue Man Group drum trainer there. So he sort of put me through the paces, showed me everything I needed to know for the show, which is a pretty complex thing. It was great because the drummer actually was almost like the conductor of the show, because as a drummer you would throw drum cues based on what you saw the Blue Man doing, and that would then communicate to the rest of the band what part of a song to go into. So it was really intense. It was amazing. It was a great experience. It's something I'll probably dive into in a later podcast. But I ended up playing for Blue Man Group for about 2 years. And during that time, I was always continuously studying the music software, especially Ableton. Ableton turned out to be the software of choice that I just completely fell in love with. I loved the workflow of Ableton and just the whole approach, because I felt like any other music software that I had used apart from Reason, like Logic and all that kind of thing, it seemed to be made for engineers, but Ableton seemed to be made for musicians who wanted to perform. And that's why I completely fell in love with it. So whilst I was playing with Blue Man Group, I was playing like 5 or 6 shows per week. And in between shows, everyone had their laptops out, and I was just, on Ableton working on stuff and just learning the software, basically trying to dive deeper and deeper into the subject matter. And then towards the end of 2008, there was the huge economic crash that affected people all over the world, and the show that I was in actually ended up closing down, and Blue Man Group laid off a whole bunch of people. To be honest with you, I was actually kind of happy that the show came to an end, because even though the show itself, every single one was different, because there was always small variations that would change within each show, at the end of the day, I was always playing the same show. And that's something that I've learned over the years, is that I'm not very good at doing that. I love the casting process, and hopefully getting chosen to do a gig, and then learning the material, and then going out and playing those initial shows, and working my way up to being able to make the best version I can of that show. And that usually happens within, say, the first 6 months of working with a band. And then you kind of, everything starts to become routine, and that's when things kind of change for me. I find that I tend to end up getting bored if I'm always just playing the same music. So remember, like I said, I'd been playing with Blue Man Group for, I guess, something like 18 or 20 months. I probably played somewhere along the lines of 200 shows within those 18 months, each show being, I think, about 2 hours long. So it was a pretty intense time, and I have to say I was kind of glad when it was over, even though I really, really enjoyed it and learned a lot. But as that was coming to an end, I ended up, going online and just surfing around, seeing if there was any opportunities I could just find as to, what I was going to do next. And I stumbled across a website that was part of Cirque du Soleil, and it was a sort of like online job marketplace, like an internal marketplace for Cirque du Soleil jobs. And I was like, ooh, this is cool. And I kind of, just looked through it, and I saw they had a position opening up for a drummer on a touring show. And I was like, oh, that sounds cool. I didn't really think much of it, but I was like, I wrote to them and I said, I'm interested. This is what I've done. I've done Blue Man Group and blah, blah, blah. And I expressed interest in it. And actually, very shortly thereafter, I received an email that they would be interested in having me audition. And this was actually a pretty interesting audition, because up until this time, anytime I had to audition to play with a band as a session drummer, I would usually fly out somewhere and play with the band, and based on how it felt with the people in the room, they would either offer me the gig or they wouldn't. But in this particular case, it was completely different. They said, okay, we're going to send you like an electronic kit with the tracks that you have to learn, with 2 versions actually. One with the drums on it that you will be playing, and then another version without the drums. And then what we want you to do is record yourself playing to these tracks with the MP3s without the drums on it, and to then record the video and audio, put it together, and then send that back to us with you performing to these tracks. And that was like, whoa, that's cool. It felt very, very futuristic. So I ended up doing that, and then to cut another long story short, basically I got asked to join one of the Cirque du Soleil shows called Kuza. So this was around about the end of 2008, and the show was starting in July, I believe, of 2009, at least the position that was opening up for me. So I had a good, 6-7 months to just hang out and do what I want whilst waiting to go on tour. Now, like I mentioned before, I'd been a fan of Blue Man, and it was a dream to play with them, and it was an honor to be asked to become part of their production. Well, you know, it was exactly the same deal with Cirque du Soleil. I was a huge fan of their shows. I'd seen a bunch of their performances on television, and the thought of entering into this company was just wild. It was like, you know, because Blue Man Group, I don't know how many employees they might have had at the time I was performing with them. I'm guessing maybe 300 or something like that. Well, Cirque du Soleil had over 2,000 employees at the time, and I think they had 16 or 17 unique shows when I joined them back then. You know, I was part of Kuza, and there was, you know, I think they had like 6 or 7 shows in Las Vegas at the time, and, you know, a bunch of touring shows. So I ended up flying out to Montreal to, you know, be fitted with my costume and to learn how to do my makeup. And I got to hang out at the headquarters and just see this enormous entertainment giant and the inner workings of it. And it was mind-blowing. It was an amazing experience. Again, I was living the dream. You know, I wanted to become a session musician, and now I was playing with Cirque du Soleil, and I went on the road with them, and that was just another, yet again, mind-blowing experience. I toured with them all throughout North America from 2009 till 2010. Got to meet amazing musicians, but also one of the best parts of it was to work with all of these acrobats and to see, you know, how much work they would put into what they did every day. You know, as a musician, to be honest with you, I'm a lazy musician. At the height of it, I might have been practicing, you know, 90 minutes a day. I really didn't practice that much, but it was enough to sort of get by, and, you know, it worked for me. But these acrobats would be training for 2-3 hours a day before they would do the show. It was absolutely mind-blowing. And you had trapeze artists, high wire artists, jugglers, and just all of these different amazing athletes and acrobats and artists just doing their thing. And it was completely mind-blowing and a brilliant experience, and something that I will always cherish having been able to do. But like with Blue Man Group, after about 6 months, they asked me if I would like to extend my contract, because I had a 1-year contract when I signed up with them. And I had to say no, because, you know, like I said, around that 6-month period, that's when I start getting into the routine of things. And, you know, I'd been playing, I think, 5 or 6 shows per week with Blue Man Group. With Cirque du Soleil, I was playing, I think it was like 8 shows a week, and we had 1 day off per week. So Tuesdays all the way through Sunday, we were playing either 1 to 2 shows per day. And again, I think these shows were like 2.5 hours long each. All of a sudden, I had probably the worst news I'd ever had in my life. And that was that both of my kidneys had failed whilst I was on the road. I was in San Diego at the time with Cirque du Soleil. And from one day to the next, everything changed. I was rushed to hospital from the Cirque du Soleil tent, and the ER people took my blood, came back and said, "Oh my God, your kidneys are both failing right this very minute." So to cut a horrible long story short, basically what ended up happening was I was chronically ill. I had to immediately stop the tour, fly back for emergency dialysis treatments, which is where a machine cleans your blood every few days. And that basically was my life all of a sudden. I went from being a very successful session musician just to being sick and in a really, really big health crisis. So that was in 2010. But I did the best not to let it get to me. I had accrued some savings whilst working with Cirque du Soleil, and I decided, okay, you know, this is a terrible, terrible thing, but I'm going to try to make the best of it. And what I did was I ended up saying, okay, I'm going to invest in a home studio, because all I had was these dialysis treatments, which were every other day, and I had some savings, so I didn't have to go to work immediately, which I wouldn't have been able to do anyway. So like I said, I ended up buying myself a home studio. I bought myself a huge iMac, like the best top-of-the-line iMac at the time. I bought the most current version of Ableton Live. I ended up buying a Native Instruments machine. Even though the Ableton PUSH had just been released around about then, I had seen videos of the first generation of the Native Instruments machine, and I was like, oh, that looks amazing. So I ended up buying that. And pretty much for about a year after that, all I did was just hang out in this studio and I just made music. Even though it was a horrible experience with my health, it was one of the coolest times in my life because I had enough savings not to worry. And I was living another dream of mine, which was to just compose music and produce and do nothing all day apart from these health treatments than just music on my own. And just it was a kind of a little adventure that I went on. In hindsight, it was a cool thing, even though it was all pretty terrible. Now, as time progressed, I ended up opening a teaching studio here because I had a transplant, a kidney transplant, which meant that I didn't have to do these dialysis treatments anymore. I was pretty much able to lead a normal life again, but I knew I didn't want to go on the road. I didn't want to tour because I just started a family. I had a daughter, a little baby girl, and I was like, that's it. I don't want to tour anymore. So I need to kind of figure out what I'm going to do with my life. So the thing that seemed to be most natural was, because like I said, I lived pretty much in the middle of nowhere. So that meant there weren't really many drum teachers where I lived. So I decided to open my own drum teaching studio. That was back around 2011, 2012. That became my new source of income. I ended up getting enough students to be able to live off of that. And I did that for quite a few years up until the end of 2015. And that's when one of the biggest changes happened in my new trajectory of my music career. I ended up buying the Ableton PUSH 2. It had just recently been released, I think in November of 2015. And I saw Jonathan Stein. He did a video for Ableton, which is like a 20-minute short video of him creating a track on the Ableton PUSH 2. And I found that so mind-blowing. Like, just to remind you where I came from, I came from, the Commodore 64, the Atari, first version of Cubase, then the QY70, the Roland SP808, then the machine, the Native Instrument machine, and now this seemed to be like the perfect piece of equipment, the piece of equipment I'd always been dreaming of. And I decided to take the little savings that I actually ended up having left towards the end of 2015, and I was like, I'm going to invest it into an Ableton PUSH 2, which ended up being one of the best decisions I actually ever made. And in January of 2016, I decided, okay, I'm going to sort of rebrand myself and reinvent myself. And that's when I came up with Push for Life, because I was like, I'm going to use this push forever, and that's all I'm ever going to need. So it was Push for Life. And the other thing that I kind of really liked about the name Push for Life, in one sense it was meant to be about the Ableton Push, but on another level it was about living life, to push for life, as all of the health stuff that I had gone through. So that's kind of the story behind the name Push for Life. And I ended up, just diving into the Ableton PUSH. That's all I cared about pretty much for the last 2 years. I put some tutorials online that ended up becoming quite successful, and then I ended up, putting out the courses and stuff that people are really familiar with now, who know me as Push for Life. So yeah, that's pretty much the story. It's been a long story. So, and if you're still listening, thank you so much for taking the time to check out what it is I have done so far. It feels a little self-indulgent, to be honest with you, but I just wanted to put this particular podcast together, this sort of autobiographical one, just so you have context as a listener as to what it is that I do and where it is that I come from. But also that way in the future, when I reference certain things, I can always send people back to this particular podcast when if they want to sort of dive deeper into where it is that I've come from. Now, the thing is, like I mentioned in the first episode of this podcast, I really feel like I need a change in my life right now. And that brings me back to that Zen koan that I said at the very beginning of this episode. First there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. Like I said, what that has come to mean for me is, first there is a mountain, meaning, that sort of connection that people have to their higher selves, or whatever it is you want to call it, higher power, intuition, flow. When we're children and usually sort of young teenagers, we're all still connected to that. I had this extremely strong connection to my sort of higher self, that sort of artistic flow. I never really thought about stuff much. It just sort of emptied out of me. And then, once I got back from Los Angeles and I had this real low, things became more about sort of making a living as a musician, and everything sort of became more of like a mental effort than sort of like tapping into this higher self spiritual flow type of thing when I made music. And that really has been up until recently, and literally, like I mentioned in the first episode, around the summer of 2017, so just a few months ago, when I started getting back into making like sound installations and creating music again and discovering modular synthesis, all of a sudden I feel like I'm slowly starting to tap back into this higher self intuitive flow state that I remember from what seems like forever ago. But this is all very new and very fresh, and that's why I feel like this is the perfect time for me to start this podcast, because that way, as time progresses and I sort of tap more and more into this higher self of mine, hopefully I can shine some light on the process for other people who might be experiencing something similar to what I've experienced, because I think it's almost like a universal experience of humans, to be honest with you. For those of you who are familiar with Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, like it's an archetypical journey of the human being, where any movie that you watch, especially any kind of Hollywood movie that you watch, there's always this sort of protagonist who's shown in his normal world. First there is a mountain, his normal world, and then something happens that sort of rips him out of this normal version of himself, where he then, or he or she, has to sort of go through this intense, hard process, only to sort of re-find themselves, but a newer version of themselves, which ends up sort of being the process, the journey they go through, and they reinvent themselves sort of towards the end of the movie and become this better version of themselves, so to speak. So, like I said, first there is a mountain, then there's no mountain, then there is. What I kind of want to communicate to you, my audience, is just, this is something we all go through, and I feel like I have something to share right now, because I'm sort of coming out the other end of that process, especially where I was so sick to almost having died with the whole kidney failure thing and dialysis thing. One of my biggest goals that I have left is to just share my process with the next generation, to pass on the flame, just as people like Bluey have done for me. The generation above me was always so kind to me and sort of like would mentor me, and that to me was always invaluable. The experience of the older generation passed on to me, they passed on the flame to me, and if I can somehow just pass on this flame that I have received to a handful of people through this podcast, I really will feel like I've done my part. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it's made sense. It's almost a little bizarre to do this. I'm like sitting here in my studio just talking into this mic, and to think that, at some point in time other people are going to be listening to this. It's still a very new experience for me, so please bear with me. Like I said, I'm very humbled that you would even listen this far, and thank you so much. And I will see you in the next episode. Take care, and I look forward to continuing this journey with you. And of course, don't forget to check out Music, Sounds and Silence for the show notes of this episode. There you'll find links and resources for all of the stuff that I mentioned. Peace.